This meeting is now being recorded.
This webinar is different than previous ones we've had, and that it's shorter. We only have one speaker, and it's focused on a single topic. Today, Laurie Racca will be updating us on the recent changes to licensure laws that affect professional geologists. So before we get started, I want to go over a few ground rules and get everyone oriented to the global meat system in case you haven't used it before. If you are having trouble seeing or hearing the presentations, you want to get in touch with us by sending a note using the chat box. We're using the chat box for kind of technical things of getting people lined up and all joined in. And it's located in the lower left corner of your screen. And we'll monitor the chat box throughout. And if we see someone with a problem, we'll get on it. One of our organizers will be back at you to help you. And they'll communicate back and forth using the chat box. Now, for the questions, if you want to ask a question during the presentation, don't be shy about asking. If you look at the top of your screen, in the middle, just to the right of the middle, you'll see a Q&A function. You'll see an orange and gray dialog bubble. Click on that, and you can type in your question. After Laurie's presentation, we'll have a question and answer period. During the Q&A portion, we will read your questions and give Laurie a chance to answer. If we get the same questions more than once, or if we get a group of questions that are similar, then we'll group them together. If you have the screen display set on full screen, then the Q&A dialog button may not be visible. So to toggle back and forth between full screen and the screen with dialog boxes, you hit the little square with the arrows. It's got either the arrows on the outside of the little square. You hit that, and it'll toggle back and forth to full screen view. So I think that's all the nuts and bolts of doing this. So let me go ahead and introduce you. I'll introduce you first to our Geology Symposium in case you're new to this. The Geology Symposium is put on by California State Geologists, and we try and do it on a fairly regular basis. The mission of the Geology Symposium is to boost communication and consistency in how geologic and hydrogeologic data are applied by geologists working in state service. We want to get an idea of what geologists throughout the state are doing and how they are using data. We try to do this by providing state geologists with an opportunity to share their information, experiences, and resources. Now today, Laurie is going to brief us on recent changes to licensure law and these changes specifically that affect professional geologists. Laurie works for the California Board of Professional Engineers, Land Surveyors, and Geologists, and is a senior registrar for geology and geophysics. She is a licensed professional geologist with 25 years of experience, specializing in complex environmental site investigations and leading multidisciplinary teams. I'm happy to welcome Laurie to the Geology Symposium, and we'll turn the microphone over to her. Hey, good afternoon, Laurie, and welcome to the Geology Symposium.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the introduction, and since you've already told everybody who I am, I'll give people the short version. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laurie Racca. I've worked in the private sector, I've worked at DTSC, and I've worked at the Water Board. I recently landed the registrar gig at the Board for Professional Land Surveyors, Engineers, and Geologists. That title's just a fancy way of saying I am the staff geologist to the licensing board. So for those of you who don't have access to the webinar and are trying to scroll through the presentation by yourself, we are on the title screen now. There's a lot of information to go through today. The slides are packed with a lot of information. We're going to be going through this fairly quickly in order to respect people's time, but the whole point is to get the information to you so that you can look at it, and if you have questions later, please give me a call. As California State Geologists, we all share a common mission. We are the government, and we really are here to help. Whether your job involves protecting human health and the environment or identifying geologic hazards such as tsunami inundation zones or whether you're working for Caltrans and making sure and helping preserve our infrastructure, or like me, licensing geologists. We all work for the public benefit. So we're on the slide that talks about our objectives for today. And the main purpose is to reacquaint you with the licensing board and its functions. This presentation was requested because of several hot topics that are going on in 2017, most specifically the sign and seal requirements. However, in order to adequately address those, we need to review some key licensing concepts as the foundation for discussing the recent changes. And hopefully we will have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussions, because I find that's when we usually get the most information out to people. So the next slide is, what is professional licensure? Well, professional means being characterized by conforming to or meeting technical and ethical standards. And this is what licensing is all about. We ensure that a professional geologist or a professional geophysicist or a licensed civil engineer conforms or meets some minimum standards. Licensing, as you all know, because you have a driver's license, is the government's permission for you to do something, and it's generally required by law. However, for the licensee, being licensed confers some very important benefits. It gives you credibility, it gives you increased career opportunities, and it gives you financial incentives like Range D. This next slide I've included is a quote from the original 1968 geologic licensing legislation. And I put it here just to emphasize that the mission of the Geology Licensing Board, whether you're talking about the old board or the new board, it hasn't changed in the nearly 50 years of geology licensing in California. And as you can see on the next slide, the mission as described in the current laws for all three board professions is identical. This language is identical in the Engineers Act, the Geologists Act, and the Land Surveyors Act. I've bolded the geology one because, we are most important. However, the legislature has made it crystal clear with this language what the mission of this board is. Our highest priority is protection of the public. So, a brief history of the board. And for those of you following along, you should see a timeline now. The first of the board's professions to be regulated through licensing were the surveyors in 1891. And I've always thought this was interesting, since the creator of the first modern geologic map, William Smith, was a surveyor by trade. 1928 brought the St. Francis Dam failure, and in 1929 the legislature decided to regulate civil engineers via licensing. In 1933, the land surveyors were merged with the Engineers Board, creating the Board for Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors. The 1950s saw local cities and counties in Southern California establishing qualifications boards for geologists, mostly due to landslide issues and other geologic hazards. At one point, there were 20 separate qualifications boards in existence. This was really an unworkable situation. So in the 1960s, several attempts were made to initiate geology licensure at the state level, with success finally coming in 1968. The first licenses for PGs and CEGs were issued in 1970. The geophysicists were added to the Act in 1972, and the Certified Hydrogeology License was added in 1994. In 2009, the legislature decided to merge the Board of Registration for Geology and Geophysicists with the Engineers Board, resulting in the entity we know today, the Board for Professional Engineers, Land Surveyors, and Geologists. And believe it or not, I do have people asking me, why are the geologists last? Well, looking at this timeline, it should be pretty obvious. Our licensing act was the last to be implemented. As of 2016, the final steps of the merger were complete. It took 7 years to merge the functions and the funding for the two boards. So who is the board? Well, as this next slide shows, the board is comprised of both public members and practitioners. The public members participate because they represent consumers and the public in general, and because the public is affected by decisions that are made by the board, and therefore they have a right to participate in the process. The boards are staffed by professionals in the field for their technical expertise, their experience and judgment in their chosen field, and because they understand the ethical norms and standard of care in their industries. Betsy Matheson is the current geology board member. She was a member of the enforcement committee for the former Board of Registration for Geology and Geophysics and has participated as an exam expert for the current board. This next slide is in here just to show that the laws and regulations are pretty clear that the licensing requirements of the three professions apply to state and local public agency employees. The quote shown is from the geology regulations. However, there are similar requirements for both land surveyors and engineers. A lot of public agency employees seem to think that they are exempt from licensing laws because what they do is ministerial. If you look at the definition of ministerial, it does not involve discretion or judgment. It's a check-the-box kind of thing. So if the only thing you do is accept an application, verify that it's signed, and cash the check, that's ministerial. But if you are like me and you are making a decision on the qualifications of the person in that application, whether or not they have the proper education to become a licensed geologist, whether they have relevant geologic experience, that requires a licensee because that's a professional technical judgment. Another thing that's often misunderstood by folks is that the board has several different types of licenses. There are Practice Act licenses, Title Act licenses, and title authorities. The Practice Act licenses are the license that enable you to practice your profession. We regulate both the use of the title professional geologist, and we regulate the fact that you can perform geologic work. The title acts are something that are unique to the engineers. The board can only regulate the use of the title. The board feels that these are not protective, however, they are authorized in the law. So, for example, a traffic engineer could commit negligence, and the only thing the board could do would be to take away his title or her title. The board could not prevent that person from practicing traffic engineering. The recent attempts to create an environmental engineer Title Act license was opposed by the board for this very reason. The title authorities are something entirely different. The title authorities are an additional authorization by the board subsequent to your foundation license. So, for example, only a licensed professional geologist can earn the title Certified Engineering Geologist. However, one thing that people don't realize is a lot of times is that the title authority is just that. It only regulates the use of the title. They do not confer any additional practice authority. And it's been this way from the very beginning. A lot of times there's confusion about this because some state-level entities require a certified specialty geologist for certain types of work. The way that I look at this is that a client can always specify what they want in whoever they hire. The best analogy I've been able to come up with is that my medical doctor can perform plastic surgery. Would I go to my personal physician for a plastic surgery procedure? No. I would go to a board-certified plastic surgeon. Although the regulatory structures of the medical profession and the engineers and geologists and land surveyors are different, this is the best analogy I can come up with. However, any geologist in California can practice engineering geology or hydrogeology without getting the specialty title. So this is just here to review where the laws and the regulations are pertaining to your practice of geology or geophysics. As a reminder, the legislature and the governor pass and create laws. Public entities develop regulations to implement them. So the Geologists and the Geophysicists Act, along with the Professionals Engineers Act and the Professional Land Surveyors Act, are all part of the Business and Professions Code. And one thing that you need to keep in mind is that there are other sections of the Business and Professions Code that apply to your license. There's a general section that applies to all licenses regulated under the Business and Professions Code. So if you see a reference to the General Business and Professions Code in the geologist law, you should pay attention and look it up and see what it's referring to. So, which license? Which license? This is the most common question we get. The laws and regulations are important because most of the questions we get can be answered by going to the definitions in the laws and the regulations. Unfortunately, a lot of times the waters get muddied by inaccurate or imprecise references to the licensing laws, either just in general usage or even in other laws and regulations. Unfortunately, we're all human beings and nobody's perfect. So sources of confusion can include listing several different license types in one sentence of a regulation as qualified professionals. The example, a professional geologist, licensed civil engineer, landscape architect, or professional forester. When this is done in a law or a regulation, the tendency for most people is to interpret it that these licenses are interchangeable, and that's not what it means at all. What this means is that only the licensed geologist can do the geology part, the licensed civil engineer can do the engineering part, et cetera, et cetera. The next example is from the California Health and Safety Code, and I believe it was referring to closure of hazardous waste facilities. The certification shall be signed by the owner or operator and by an independent qualified professional engineer. The problem with the title professional engineer is it doesn't necessarily mean civil engineer. It doesn't necessarily mean chemical engineer. Any engineer licensed by this board is authorized to use the title professional engineer. So what did this agency intend this regulation to mean? I would hope that they meant that the appropriately licensed professional engineer in that discipline that pertains to that specific site is the one we want. However, a lot of people automatically assume professional engineer and licensed civil engineer are the same. They are not. The other problem we get sometimes is that people assume that other agency laws and regulations define the practice of the licensed professions. I got an employee of another agency tell me that of course they were qualified for the geology license because they were a geologist and their agency hired them to do work, and therefore that work must be geology. Doesn't quite work that way. So who determines the practice of geology? Well, the answer to that is the legislature. The legislature defined that via the law in 1968. This definition has not changed in the last 48 and a half years. But even the legislature can create confusion. For example, under the qualifications portion of the law, the legislature decided that California would implement a California-specific exam for the geology licensing test. And they specified that that exam was going to be on the geology and seismicity of California, as well as the laws and regulations that pertain to the practice of geology in California. So on the exam, you will see questions associated with health and safety regulations. That does not mean that health and safety regulations are the practice of geology. That just means that the legislature and the governor, when they wrote the law, decided that that's what the content of the exam would be. Another definition that geologists should be aware of is the definition of civil engineering. Geologists and civil engineers often work together, and there are prohibitions on geologists practicing engineering. So if you don't know what the definition is, it's kind of hard to stay out of trouble. Moving on to the next slide on exemptions. We get questions about this one as well. Yes, the federal government is exempt from the licensing laws as long as they are doing federal work. If they're trying to do something on the side and make a little extra money, then yes, that person has to be licensed appropriately. However, if they're acting as an agent of the federal government, they don't have to be licensed. Keep in mind that this can apply to federal contractors as well. The law on this is much more complicated than I can possibly explain in a PowerPoint presentation. But the thing you should realize is that it's evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and if you need help looking at a particular situation, we will do what we can to help you out. There's also an exemption for subordinates, and this should make total sense to all of you because how else would you get your work experience? The subordinate must be working under the responsible charge of a licensee. And then the most popular one, the limited exemption for civil and petroleum engineers. This does not allow engineers to practice or offer to practice geology or geophysics. It's intended to relate to their practice of engineering. The most typical example is evaluating soil or lithology as part of the design of a building foundation. So we're going to go through a couple of examples, but first we're going to talk about competence. Your license does not authorize you to do everything. It only authorizes you to do that which you are competent. For example, my career has been spent in environmental hydrogeology. Can I do engineering geology under my license? Yes, I can. Would I do engineering geology? Would I take responsible charge of an engineering geology project? Not a chance. It's been so long since I did any engineering geology work, and it's been so long since I received any education or training in engineering geology, I do not feel that I am competent to do that work. This is really important when you're talking about the limited exemption for civil engineers. They have the same competence clause in their regulations. So a civil engineer may be exempt and may be able to evaluate the geology at a particular site as it relates to their civil engineering. However, if they are not competent to do so, if they have no training or experience in that particular area, then they should not be doing it. So moving on to our first example. Can a licensed geologist make recommendations about human health risk from contamination? Well, if you remember that definition of geology from the previous slide, there's nothing in there about toxicology. So as far as I'm aware, there is no license for risk assessors or toxicologists. So basically, anybody can do it legally. However, if you are doing simple toxicology as part of your environmental work, you should definitely not imply that your geology license qualifies you to do that work. Example number 2, unlicensed practice. Phase 1 environmental site assessment. Now, for those of you who don't work in the environmental field, a Phase 1 environmental site assessment is basically a research project that is done when commercial property changes hands. It is intended to make sure that the person who is buying the property is not inheriting some big environmental problem. Most of a Phase 1 isn't geology. It's research, it's interviews, it's consulting, agency files. However, 10 to 20% of a Phase 1 involves fate and transport assessments, and they're usually done with very little data. This is done so that somebody can determine whether or not an off-site source of contamination is migrating to the property in question. This is pretty clearly the practice of geology. So, example, a PG versus a PE. Can a licensed geologist do basic septic system design? And the board's favorite answer is, it depends. Most people really, really hate this answer. The problem is, without going and promulgating a regulation, if the board comes out and makes a blanket statement about any type of practice area, it's going to be viewed by OAL as underground regulation. So whenever you inquire about something at the board, you're more than likely going to get an answer that says, it depends on the specifics of your situation, and then we'll try and walk you through the logic. So, for a septic system design, the design of a septic system pretty clearly falls under civil engineering as sewerage. However, most septic systems that we're talking about in this instance involve single-family residences. A commercial project would pretty typically have a civil engineer already designing it. So for your standard residential septic system, most of the time it's going to be a pre-designed, out-of-the-box system that's specified under county requirements. It's already been designed. Therefore, it doesn't require the approval or responsible charge of a licensed civil engineer. However, when you start tinkering with it, or if you design a custom system, then it would require a licensed civil engineer to be in responsible charge. So what about perk tests or evaluating the soil to figure out whether or not the soils can accept the waste, if they could handle the volume? Well, that's pretty clearly the practice of geology. However, a civil engineer can be in responsible charge of that portion of the work because sewerage is defined as civil engineering, and that's directly related to the practice of civil engineering. I got another question via email today about whether or not a geologist could work on a monitoring well system around a landfill, and whether or not this was considered a civil engineering project. Well, if you walk through the same logic, first off, it's going to depend on the specifics of your situation. Refuse disposal is pretty clearly the practice of civil engineering. However, you've also got to look into the competence clause. For example, when I worked at Department of Toxics, I worked on a site called the Stringfellow Acid Pits. There's a $40 million groundwater treatment system there. That's pretty clearly the practice of civil engineering. The question becomes, are the extraction wells attached to that treatment system civil engineering? You could make the argument that they are. However, all of the responsible professionals got together in that unit and decided that the geologists were more competent to design the wells. So we made the business decision that the geologists would be doing the extraction wells below ground, and anything above ground attached to them would be the responsibility of the engineers. So my advice to you in situations like this is have faith in your abilities as a responsible, licensed professionals to make appropriate decisions based on the facts of your specific situation. You're all scientists, you're trained to think, you can use the scientific method, and if there's an issue, you get together with the people you work with and you try and develop a reasonable and appropriate conclusion based on the data that you have. There will not be a line in the sand in many of these cases. However, if you can't figure it out after you've tried, give us a call and we'll try and help you walk through it. Which gets us to the next slide, which is the first of several on the concept of responsible charge. Responsible charge is defined in the Geologists Act, the Engineers Act, and the Land Surveyors Act, and it's pretty much the same definition. It means you are in charge independently and make the final decisions on your technical work. What confuses people sometimes is the definition of responsible position in the regulations. This goes back to people earning their work experience under a licensed professional. And somebody in a responsible position is not doing technician-level work. They are making scientific decisions, technical decisions, under a licensee. The engineers and land surveyors have some additional explanatory definitions in the board rules for engineers and land surveyors. Unfortunately, the geologists do not. That is going to be one of our tasks for 2017, is to develop a rulemaking to add some explanatory language to the regulations so that people understand what responsible charge means. The second slide on responsible charge should look familiar to most people who've ever heard of President Harry Truman. The buck stops here, his famous sign on his desk. And as Winston Churchill said, the price of greatness is responsibility. The corollary for licensure is the price of the benefits that licensing confers on you, such as credibility, career opportunities, and financial incentives, is responsibility for making the technical decisions. The next slide on responsible charge is a summary of an article that was in the board bulletin back, I think it was in winter 2016 or 2015. I'd have to check. But it goes back to President Truman's sign. Who is making and reviewing or approving the final decisions? Please note that responsible charge does not include management control. It doesn't include administrative or project management functions. It does not include the concept of corporate financial liability. Your license is issued to you as an individual, not to your company and not to your agency. So, for example, if your boss is licensed but you're making the final decisions on your own projects, then you are in responsible charge. If your boss makes changes to your work, then he or she is sharing responsible charge, or if they overrule your work and you do not agree and you can't come to a resolution, then your boss has accepted responsible charge for that portion of the work. Sometimes 2 or 3 people will be in responsible charge in a project. It may be different portions of the work. So the key thing on that case is to make sure you note who does what. Now, all of this discussion about responsible charge is important because of the next slide, the use of the seal. Signing and sealing a document is an indication that you are in responsible charge. Prior to January 1st, 2017, the geology law required that you either sign or seal your documents, your technical geologic documents. So when I worked for the Water Board, or I worked for DTSC, or I worked in private practice, and I signed a technical memo, Laurie, Racca, PG, that was the equivalent of sealing that document. I was accepting responsible charge for my work. The only thing that's changed as of January 1st is now I'd have to seal it as well. It's not an option anymore. And the question I get on this is why? Why did we do this? Why don't the engineers have to do this? Well, the engineers and land surveyors have always had to sign and seal their documents. The geologist had a conflict between the regulations and the law. And from a consumer perspective, it was confusing because engineers had to sign and seal, and geologists had to sign or seal. So a consumer had no, unless they were highly educated, had no way of knowing the difference, that the geologist could just sign their name, Laurie, Racca, PG. So we eliminated the confusion. Nothing has really changed. If you are in responsible charge, the only difference is now you have to seal it as well as sign it. So I've been getting a ton of questions on the use of the seal. The first is, what designs can I use? Well, the minimum requirements for the designs are specified in the law and the regulation. You should note that there's nothing in the law or regulations that prevents you from adding to the minimum requirements. The key things are your name, your license number, your professional geologist title, and the state of California. You could add extra circles on the outside of the stamp. You could make the stamp bigger. You can add stars between the words. You could add a logo. Same thing with the Certified Title Authority license stamps. The next question I get on the next slide is, can I use my old registered geologist stamp? The answer is no. That title was not grandfathered into the law back in 2005 when the titles were changed from registered geologist to professional geologist. So the only authorized titles are professional geologist, professional geophysicist, certified engineering geologist, and certified hydrogeologist. The next question I get is, can I use a combined stamp? And this is usually generated because of the old combined design that was authorized in the older regulations. The answer is yes, if you can fit all of the design requirements into your stamp. I haven't seen anybody do it yet. Usually the stamp's just not big enough to include both titles, both PG and specialty numbers, along with your name and the state of California. So your older combined stamp isn't valid and hasn't been for several years, not just because it might say registered geologist, but because it typically didn't include your practice authority license. On the next slide, can I use initials or a nickname? And I've given an example using the name John Fitzgerald Kennedy. John F. Jack Kennedy includes that person's given name and a nickname and would be acceptable. However, the stamp should not include only the nickname, because the name on your actual certificate, your actual license, needs to be represented on your seal in some manner. If you want to use your nickname, you should file a name change affidavit with the board. And the whole point of this is to make sure that we can clearly tie your stamp to you, because the license was issued to you. People are also asking about electronic stamps or signatures, and these have been allowed for several years. It's my understanding that our colleagues at Caltrans use these on a regular basis. If you have questions about how the mechanics of it, the board's not going to tell you how to do it. They're not going to tell you what security protocol to use or what type of software to use. And the reason behind that is that technology changes so quickly that we would never be able to keep up with regulations. So if you have a question about the mechanics of using an electronic stamp or seal, I'd call somebody that does it, maybe a colleague at Caltrans. And the next slide, blue or black ink. Doesn't matter. There's nothing in the law or regulations that specifies the required color of ink. What about an expiration date? There's nothing in the current law or regulations that require an expiration date. However, you should remember you can't use your seal if you don't pay your fee and your license is expired. The next question I get often on the next slide is, what about peer review? Well, the thing you need to decide is who's in responsible charge of what. Was the peer review just checking for typos, or is it again a situation with your boss where that person may be assuming part of the responsibility because they're making technical judgments about your work and convincing you to change them? The big thing with multiple licensees is to ensure that whenever you have two or more licensees sharing responsible charge of work, that you note who did what. It's really, really easy to do that when you're drafting a document. 10 years down the line, when a complaint's filed, it's not so easy. What I typically see is somebody saying, this was prepared by John Smith and it was reviewed by Susie Q. Or if it's a document that can be divided, somebody will say, so-and-so was in responsible charge of this portion of the work and another person was in charge of that portion of the work. We see this a lot with private consultants where the preparer of the report signs and seals the report, and then a corporate officer signs and seals the report as the corporate approval. However, the corporate officer most of the time didn't have anything to do with the work and really wasn't in responsible charge. However, because they didn't indicate that, when a complaint is filed and that report is entered into evidence, we have no way of being able to document that. And the next slide, license renewal. Again, you can only practice geology if your license is not expired. If it's under 30 days late, there's no delinquency fee. Over 30 days, less than 5 years, you must pay all accrued fees. Over 5 years, you're basically starting over. You're going to have to requalify, retest, and you'll get an entirely new license number. The merger of the two boards resulted in the engineers adopting this same policy. I believe they have 60 days before their licenses are delinquent, but they used to be able to petition the board and get their expired license reinstated, no matter how long it was since they last renewed. However, now the board has decided that the geologists had this part right, and that if an engineer or land surveyor lets their license lapse for greater than 5 years, they are also starting over now. That's one benefit of the board merger, is we get to take the best from each discipline and implement it across the board. Now, the next portion of the law that was recently added is Section 7881.5, the Online Laws and Regulations Assessment at the Time of Renewal. There's been a ton of misinformation about this before it was passed, and I really don't understand why. The only thing I can think of is that the people who were spreading the rumors had no idea what was actually in the legislation. This has never been intended as an additional test, technical test similar to your initial license exam, and we never intended to charge for it. It is not an attempt to prevent you from renewing your license. It is intended to be a review. During the board's last sunset review, we found that 45% of the violations that were discovered or initiated by this board were not technical. They were administrative, violations of the administrative requirements. They had nothing to do with technical negligence. They had nothing to do with technical incompetence. And the board decided that was just a waste of everybody's time. Why should you have to come in and respond to a complaint for something administrative just because you didn't keep up to date on the laws and regulations? So they got a sponsor and got the legislation initiated to include this review at the time that your license is renewed. And it's similar to most mandated state employee training, like your defensive driver training, your sexual harassment training, the ethics training you have to do if you file the Form 700. Unfortunately, because of the misinformation that was out there, we weren't sure this was going to pass. So we did not dedicate any resources to develop the training and purchase the software until after Governor Brown signed the law. So if you are renewing in the first half of this year and you're looking for the training, it's not ready yet. It should be available during the second half of this year. Additional changes that were implemented in 2017 involved the qualifications for the professional geologist license. Back in 2004, the former board eliminated the option for qualifying for a license with 30 semester hours of geology coursework. This has been a problem because there are a lot of multidisciplinary degrees out there, and not everybody has the traditional Bachelor of Science in Geology. So the board has decided to add the 30 semester hours back in and promulgate a list of required classes in the regulations. We should be beginning that effort with the February 2017 board meeting. But the 30 semester hours option is in effect as of January 1st. Another recent change, I believe it was 2014 or 15, was the implementation of a retired license option. And this allows someone who's retired and no longer practicing to use the title retired professional geologist or retired professional geophysicist. A lot of folks felt they earned that right, and they wanted to be able to do that legally. Keep in mind that if you do take advantage of this, it's a one-time fee, but you cannot practice. If you choose to return to active status, you're going to have to pass the exam again. Also out of the Sunset Review, when the legislature was looking at our enforcement statistics, they questioned why it took so long to resolve a lot of enforcement cases. They were stunned to realize that there was nothing in the law or the regulations to require that a licensee respond when a complaint was filed against them. So the legislature added this section of the law for the board. Basically, this means if somebody files a complaint against you and we contact you, you have to respond. And not responding is another violation. This ensures that we know that you understand there's a complaint against you and that you understand that you are being given the opportunity to defend yourself. Now, your response could be, talk to my attorney. That's fine, but that is a response. The Geology and Geophysics account was finally merged with the Engineers and Land Surveyors account as of July 1st, 2016. This completes the merger of the two boards. And there's already a few benefits being noticed by licensees, the first of which is the ability to renew your license online. Prior to July 1st, 2016, the two programs and the two funds were run in parallel. Now that the accounts are merged, you can renew your license online with a credit card. There is a convenience fee. I believe it's $1, but it is an option for you. Additionally, if you are in the process of obtaining your license, if you fail to pass one of the exams and you need to refile to take the exam that you didn't pass, there is no longer a refile fee. All you have to do is pay for the cost of the exam. And for geologists, this was $250 each time you applied to take an exam. Now your refile fee is $0 instead of $250. Other regulations you should be aware of is the address requirement. You must notify us when your address changes. If your license expires because your renewal notice went to the wrong address, that's not our problem. Your address of record does not have to be your residence. It can be your work. It can be a P.O. box. However, I see several hundred people every month fail to renew their license because we get a return on their renewal notice. Fingerprinting. This is something that still has a lot of people confused, although the legislature mandated it for us in 2015. A lot of the other professional licenses, especially the medical licenses, have always required a background check. And in 2015, the legislature mandated that we do it for engineers, geologists, and land surveyors. So if you got your PG before this requirement and you apply for a specialty title authority such as the CEG or CHG, don't be surprised, you will be required to provide your fingerprints. If you do not, your application does not pass go. It will sit in the file until we get it. It's part of the application process. You should also keep in mind that we will always receive a criminal history record check on you. I had an applicant who had a GIT certificate and had submitted his fingerprints back in 2015. He applied for his PG license this cycle and failed to disclose that he had a conviction between when he got his GIT and when he applied for his PG. So not only did he lie on his application, he didn't realize that we would get it from DOJ as part of his application process. It's been about a year, and his application has been delayed. He's finally getting through the process this time. Other things you should be aware of is Section 3060. Hopefully none of you will ever need this. This is the section that deals with denial, suspension, or revocation of a professional license. And note, this is one of those sections that references those general business and professions code requirements. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I really hope none of you ever have to deal with this. The other thing you should realize is that there is a code of professional conduct that you are required to abide by as part of your license. It's pretty common sense things, attribute proper credit, only practice in areas of competence, don't lie on your application, protect confidential information. You should definitely read through that. Another thing that often public agency employees don't realize is that the public license notification requirements applies to you. I realize that this section of the regulation uses in many places things like firm or client, etc., but yes, you are required to comply with the public license notification requirements. I personally display my license certificate in my office. I noticed that California Geologic Survey has a list of their responsible charge licensees on a plaque in their public reception area. Any of those methods are fine. You do have to have your PG number on your business cards, etc., etc. You should become familiar with those requirements. And before somebody asks me, yes, there are requirements for public notice for engineers and land surveyors. They are slightly different, but they do have similar requirements. So in conclusion, some important facts about professional licensure that you should remember. Licensure includes an evaluation of your education, your work experience, and the examinations. So you are applying to become licensed. You are not applying to sit for the exam. We license individuals, not companies. You, as an individual, are in responsible charge. not companies, not agencies. Laws and regulations change through time. The concept of evolution should be quite familiar to most geologists, so please keep up to date on the laws and regulations. And just because a geologist does something doesn't make it geology. And in conclusion, the board exists to protect the public, not to promote the profession. If you want the board to do something, anything, you need to keep in mind our core mission of protection of the public and demonstrate to the board why what you want will provide increased protection of the public. If you want to promote your profession, join AEG, AWG, EEGS, or any of the other professional societies. And please stay informed. It's very, very easy to do so. Go to our webpage. Click on one of the links at the bottom of the page. We have an email subscription, Facebook page, Twitter feed, whatever you prefer. And up at the very top of the page in the upper right-hand corner is a link to the laws and regulations. The electronic laws and regulations are great because you can do a word search to find exactly what you need. And each year, at the beginning of the year, we post an annotated version showing you what changed from last year. In conclusion, I'd just like to thank the members of the GeoSym committee for organizing this presentation, and then just ask for questions.
Okay, Laurie, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. First is, how are board members selected and installed? And what is the point of the Title Act? What's its purpose?
Well, the board members, you can apply to be a board member. The board members, if you want to go back, hopefully I won't make anybody too dizzy here. The board members are generally appointed by the governor with certain exceptions. There is one appointment by the Senate Rules Committee and one by the Speaker of the Assembly. So basically you fill out the form and apply when there's a vacancy. And as far as the Title Act, that's something very specific to engineers. I am not totally familiar with the history of it. And like I said, the board does not support any new Title Act licenses. I know over the course of time they eliminated a lot of them. I'm not really sure what the point is. And I think that's kind of the board's feeling too, as far as I can tell.
Okay, and then I have a question about fingerprints. Are fingerprints checked when people get admitted to the exam, or are the fingerprints just taken once they become a licensed geologist?
Fingerprints are submitted with your application. In California, you go to a live scan location like you would if you were coaching soccer for your kids' school. There's a form on our website that you have to use because it authorizes us specifically to receive the information. So if you've had it done before for some reason, no, we can't just access that. You have to specifically authorize us to receive it. So if you don't submit your fingerprints with your application, you will not be approved to proceed. So in other words, you won't be taking the exam.
Okay. Then I have another question. Can I just use a CHG stamp on documents since a PG license is a prerequisite for the CHG, or do I need to use both if using the CHG stamp?
I have not seen any legal opinion on that. My thoughts are that your PG is your practice authority license, and if you are going to use one over the other, my personal recommendation would be to use the practice authority stamp. If you need to include a CHG stamp on there for a specific type of work, or if you choose to include it, I would use both. But as far as I know, there's never been a legal opinion on that specific question.
Okay, and then I have another question, actually from here in Chatsworth. Is moral turpitude a cause for disciplinary action by the board?
Moral turpitude is not something that is defined in the law as far as I know. There are sections in the Business and Professions Code that define certain acts. Section 475 that was referenced as part of the denial or suspension of a license talks about things like committing a crime, committing fraud, one of the reasons I'm assuming that the legislature went with the background check over the old language in the law of good moral and ethical character is that it's really hard to define moral turpitude or good moral and ethical character. So if you were convicted of a felony for some reason and we found out about it, yeah, I think our enforcement unit would be looking at you, but I really don't know what moral turpitude means legally.
Oh, okay. So it's just too vague a term to really enforce, I think.
That's my understanding. I'm looking at Section 475, and it says things like conviction of a crime, commission of any act involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit with the intent to substantially benefit themselves or another or substantially injure another, knowingly making a false statement of fact or knowingly admitting a material statement of fact, things like that that can be defined. Otherwise, do you say somebody has bad morals because they don't have the same religion that you do, or they are of a different race or creed than you? It's too hard to define legally.
Okay. And then next question. I'm a licensed PG, but my title is Senior Engineering Geologist as a state employee, and I'm about to sign my name under that title and stamp the report with my PG license. How does the board view this contradiction?
It's not a contradiction. The only protected title for engineering geologist is Certified Engineering Geologist. Your job title, your HR classification has nothing to do with the licensing laws. So as long as you are noting that you are a licensed professional geologist by your signature and stamp and by doing the appropriate public license notifications as described in Section 3066, I don't have an opinion on your job title. Where it really comes into play is when somebody's applying for a Certified Engineering Geologist Title Authority license. A lot of state workers assume that their job title, engineering geologist, means they're qualified to become a certified engineering geologist. That's not necessarily true. If you are going to be applying for the CEG, you should look at the definition of engineering geology in the regulations and look at the description of the specialty in the regulations and the knowledge statements that you're required to know. A lot of times, especially in the environmental field, the applicant is actually more qualified for the CHG, but they're applying for the CEG. The definition of engineering geologist specifically references civil engineering works, and so if you can't tie your work to supporting the practice of civil engineering, it's not very likely that you're going to be qualified for the CEG.
Okay. Now, what is our legal obligation to report unlicensed activity or incompetent or negligent practice?
My guess is that's covered in two ways. First, I think there is something that you signed when you became a state employee that talks about your obligations for notification in that situation. As a licensee, I'm pretty sure that will be covered under the Code of Professional Conduct, which I'm going to. Let's see here. From a moral standpoint, I think you are morally obligated to do so, but I'm sitting here looking through the actual requirements. Hold on, getting there. I'm not seeing it in the Code of Professional Conduct, but I will take a look at that and send the answer to the GeoSymposium. You are required to provide your services in a manner in compliance with applicable law and act with competence. So if I am correct in that, as a state employee, you are required to report as a licensee, it follows that you should be required to report because you have to comply with that law. I would have to ask my attorney if that's correct, but...
Okay, but that's your take on it?
That's my personal opinion, is that, yeah, you really should be reporting technical incompetence or negligence.
Okay, now next, why is there such a discrepancy between engineering license fees and geology license fees?
Well, hopefully that'll be changing soon. Both the old Board of Geology and the current board of all three professions, we are a fee-funded agency. We do not receive general fund monies. We are supported entirely by licensee fees. And until July 1st, 2016, the geologists, of which there are approximately 5,000 active geologists and maybe 150 active licensed geophysicists, those were the population that was supporting the geology and geophysics program. The current board has a total population of approximately 115,000 licensees, including the 5,000 geologists. So the reason the engineers and land surveyors fees were so much smaller was because there was 110,000 of them to share the load. So now that the funds are merged, we are currently in the middle of doing a fee study to realign all the fees. It would be nice if we could just flip a switch and say, well, the geologists should pay what the engineers pay. However, you're all in government service, and you know that's not quite how it works. So we're in the process of justifying our request to change the fees, and I would expect that you'll see something soon. And by soon, I mean soon in government time, like within the next year or so. Right now, we've been able to eliminate the fee for the refiles. That is something we could do without the fee study, and we're slowly making changes to that. But my guess is that 115,000 people supporting the board is going to result in the lowering of the geologists and geophysicists' fees. I can't guarantee that, but it just makes common sense to do the math, if you do the math.
Okay. Now, a couple more questions. Are professional geologists required to have their number on their business cards?
Yes.
Okay, that was easy.
That was that one slide on section 3066.
Okay, and I think I have one more question. This looks like the last one. It goes back, I think, to responsible charge. It says, is a stamp required if you are reviewing work done by other professionals?
If you are a public agency employee, for example, when I worked for DTSC, I reviewed and commented on the geologic work of other people. And my comment letter or my comment memo was done under my responsible charge, and I signed it Laurie, Racca, PG, indicating that responsible charge. Now, under the January 1st, 2017 requirements, I would have to additionally stamp that. So yes, if you're reviewing other professionals' work and opining on their technical opinions, you are doing geologic technical work, and you should be signing and sealing those documents.
All right. Well, it looks like we have all the answers, all the questions. Well, yeah, we have all the answers.
We have all the answers. Yay!
We have all the questions answered. So I'm scanning my board one more time. Oh, I hold it. Okay, so I've got a couple that just came in quickly here.
Okay.
Are we required to report hazardous substances scientists who approve technical reports?
This goes back to whether or not you're required to report technical incompetence. If you see unlicensed practice, my personal opinion is that, yes, you should be reporting that. However, keep in mind that a lot of work done in the environmental field is very multidisciplinary. So while you may think that what they're doing is geology, you need to look at the definition of geology and make sure before you file a complaint that they truly are doing geology. I use the example of the Phase 1 environmental site assessment. Only about 10% or 20% of that work is actually geology. A scientist could do project management. They could interpret hazardous waste regulations. They could do chemical evaluations. Anything that an unlicensed person could do, they can do it. They just can't do the geology part of it unless they're working under the responsible charge of a licensed professional geologist. And I know that there are many environmental scientists out there who can do basic groundwater work or basic interpretations of soils work. They can't do it on their own. They have to be doing it under the responsible charge of a licensee. So my suggestion to you is, instead of, immediately going to reporting unlicensed practice, is A, to find out what they're really doing, and B, educate them. And then if they refuse to follow the law, then you would go to some kind of reporting action. I mean, we're all professionals here. We should all be working to better everybody rather than just, mark territory.
Okay, now I've got a couple more coming in about reviewing documents. One is, if you're reviewing a document, it's a federal document and it's unsigned, is that a problem?
A federal document?
Yes.
The federal government is not subject to the licensing laws. That's that federal exemption. As a public agency, if you require that the report submitted to you be signed by whoever's in charge of them, then that's up to you. However, you cannot hold them to the geologic or engineering or land surveying licensing laws if they are acting as agents of the federal government.
Okay, and then I've got want to kind of confirm, when you're reviewing a document and you're signing and sealing your review, you're only signing and sealing yours. You're not necessarily approving the work that you are reviewing.
You are only in charge of your own work. So yes, you are signing and sealing your own technical review of that document.
Okay, and then I have a similar question. Working under responsible charge of a licensee, who signs the letter for correspondence, you or the licensee?
If there is a professional technical opinion in there, then it should be signed by the licensee. However, if you are just summarizing data and referring to a technical document signed by the licensee, let's say, for example, you're doing a public participation flyer and you're signing and you're summarizing data from a technical report, you can reference that technical report signed by the licensee. However, if you're addressing a letter to an RP and you're making technical comments in that letter, then that's a technical document that should be signed by the licensee.
Okay, yeah, we're getting more coming in all the time now. Can a civil engineer sign off on the geologic review by a scientist? Now we're like, riddle me this.
Okay, so if the licensed civil engineer is doing geologic work as part of the practice of civil engineering as defined in the law, and they have the education and experience to be technically competent as required by board rules in that field, then yes, they can have anybody they want under their responsible charge, as long as they are taking responsible charge for the work. However, if it's a geology project and it has nothing to do with civil engineering, then neither of those individuals are qualified to sign off that work.
Okay, so there's a lot of ifs there.
That's
and it
why
sounds like that's one of those.
favorite answer
it depends.
Is it depends.
Okay. All right, one more, and this is: does a DTSC reviewer of unsigned federal documents have to sign and seal their review?
If your review involves the practice of geology and you are making technical geologic judgments, yes, you must sign and seal your work. Just because you're working on a federal project does not make you exempt from the licensure laws. It only makes the feds exempt from the licensure laws.
Okay, I'm getting a note from the Water Board that Water Board staff or supervisor letters and emails to consultants or property owners, or it's a question, I thought it was a statement, is Water Board staff or supervisor letters and emails to consultants or property owners, must they be signed with license number and stamped?
If you are making a technical, if you're talking about normal day-to-day correspondence, your report's late, when are you going to submit it, our review is coming, whatever. If you're doing administrative work, then no, that's not a technical document. I can write a letter to my mother and put my PG license number on there and stamp it. That doesn't make it a geologic technical document. So that's the key. You're going to have to think through the process. That's why you're licensed. You are considered responsible professionals. If your email contains technical opinions of a geologic nature, then it's considered a document.
Okay, and now we've got a question asking whether the minimum classes, the minimum classwork that's required, is that list out yet, or are they working on it?
That list is, we have some preliminary work that was done in 2015 and 2016 on the minimum coursework list. If you are interested in seeing what is being recommended to the board, what I suggest you do is go to the web page, and if you can't find this, email me and I'll send you a direct link, and go to the September 2016 Geology and Geophysics Technical Advisory Committee. There's a presentation in those meeting materials that summarizes the research that has been done and includes an early draft, a preliminary draft of the actual regulation. I can tell you that that preliminary draft has been superseded. However, the list of classes in that draft has not changed. However, a lot of the regulatory language has been cleaned up with the help of my attorney. So that's pretty much all that's available right now. The February, I believe it's 8th and 9th board meeting is when we intend to present the official draft language to the board asking for their approval to begin rulemaking. Once that happens, we'll begin the formal rulemaking process, which most state employees are familiar with, and it will take about 6 to 12 months before we get through the public comment periods, any requested hearings, the Office of Administrative Law, our supervising agency, and so my guess is that list is probably a year out from that list being finalized.
Okay.
However,
again,
if you want to see what we're thinking, you can go to that TAC meeting TAC meeting materials and see what it consists of. However, the 30 units requirement is in the law right now, so we are still evaluating people either on their degree or on 30 units.
Okay, well, I think that wraps things up. Thanks a lot for your time, Laurie. We appreciate your presentation. Now, before we go, I want to repeat the goal of the Geology Symposium. Our vision includes promoting interagency cooperation and collaboration. So if you have ideas of how we can improve the Geology Symposium or increase interagency cooperation, we'd really like to hear from you. If you have ideas for future topics, or if you know of someone who is doing interesting work and would like to make a presentation, then by all means get in touch with us. The best way to contact me and get your ideas to us is to send me an email at jnaginnis@dtsc.ca.gov. Also, contact me at my email if you'd like to help out and be part of our symposium. You definitely need to get in touch. You can help plan and implement the webinars and also help us come up with some new ideas and or maybe a new presentation topics. One way you can help right now is to fill out the survey you will receive in your email box, your email inbox. These surveys has helped us a great deal in the past, and a lot of the ideas submitted in the surveys have been incorporated into our webinars. This webinar is also being recorded, and that if you want, send me an email, and I can send you a link to the recording. We had several people request that from our last GeoSymposium. So fill out the survey, please, letting us know what you liked and didn't like and what worked and didn't work. Helps us quite a bit. It lets us know what topics are important and gives us information we need to improve our webinars. So before we go, the Geology Symposium Committee extends its thanks to our supervisors and managers for giving us the time for the webinar and supporting us in preparing and putting on the GeoSym webinars. So with that, we are sending out thank yous to the Management, Department of Water Resources, Caltrans, the Water Boards, and DTSC, and today especially to the Geology Board. Thank you everyone who logged on and participated today. We hope to have our next webinar out in the spring, and we'll send out some email announcements and a schedule once our plans really take shape. We look forward to getting together then. So now's the time to say goodbye. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.